Hi, Dan Tokar here at the Willow Forge in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. Today we're going to continue the Blacksmith's Dictionary with a tool that you may not have. Money. You say, money's not a tool. Well, that's your first problem. You've got to learn that money is a very good tool. You can use money to solve a lot of problems. And sometimes if you don't know how to use money correctly, it can cause a lot of problems. So, the first concept I want to get across to you is that money is a force multiplier, sort of like a lever or a power tool. It allows you to do some things faster and easier by applying money. Sometimes it's actually easier to job out some parts of a project than doing them yourself because somebody else is set up with the right tools, equipment, and expertise to do something faster, cleaner, better than you have the capability of doing in your shop. It's very rare that you'll run into a shop that can actually do everything equally well. As a matter of fact, I don't know of one. Even places like the Skunk Works that used to build highly engineered aircraft jobbed some things out. So anyway, first problem with money, getting money. I run into people who have a craft business sort of as a hobby, and they're quite happy to sell what they make for enough money to buy more materials to do more of what they like doing. And this is fine if you've got this as a hobby that you just want to do for fun. That's great. Then I run into people who are running it as a side business with the hopes of actually making a little money adding to their income. And they run into the problem that they still think like the hobbyists. The primary problem they have is they don't realize that time is money. Every single thing you do connected with your business costs you money. Your time is worth something. So, first problem you have is figuring out what's your time worth. And there are actually a bunch of different opinions, ideas out there about how you price your time. Because when it comes down to it, all you have to sell as a craftsman is your time. You, as a single man in a shop, can only produce so much in a week. Some of it will be of higher value or lower value, and this is also part of the problem of gauging what the work is worth, because you have different classes and types of work that you can be making and selling. So part of your problem with money is figuring out what sorts of things you can and can't do profitably in the shop. Part of that problem is your own skill set, your tools, what kind of materials you can easily lay hands on, whether you're doing things in production or doing custom work, because if you're set up to make 500 of something, the cost per unit and how many of them you can make in a given amount of time is a lot better for the bottom line than if you're doing one at a time custom work. But on the other hand, you can charge a higher hourly rate for the custom work because there are a lot fewer people doing custom work. So one of the concepts you've got to wrap your head around is that there is a market value per hour of your labor, and it's different depending on what kind of work you're doing. This is why there are a lot of blacksmith shops that specialize, because it's not that they don't know how to make other things, it's that they don't have the option of making them profitably enough to pay their overhead expenses and show a profit, actually earn some money for the guy who's running the shop. Now, I'm going to try and go through a couple of concepts very quickly for you, because even basic things are things that I find a lot of craftsmen, artisans, artists really don't seem to have any knowledge of. The first thing is that there are commercial equivalents of what you do. If you make an axe for somebody, they have the option of buying an axe that was made in a factory. So unless your axe is somehow better, different, or in some ways worth more than the factory axe, you're going to have a hard time selling them. Second concept you've got to get used to is that your time actually making things is not anywhere near the amount of time you will spend working on your business. I typically spend 45 to 50 hours a week working in or on my business. And that's down from when I was younger, when I could very easily spend 60 to 70 hours a week working on my business. I have a little bit more balance in my life, and I'm also at a stage in the business where a lot of things that I worked hard at before are no longer things that I have to spend a huge amount of time on. I've got a system to take care of those things. So, part of what you have to understand is that in the building phase of your business, you're actually going to have much higher overhead costs than once you get it actually running well. So you say, what's an example of overhead? Well, the first question I have to ask you is where are you working? If you're working in your bedroom or your basement or off of the back porch of the house that you live in, well, you say, I don't have expenses for a shop, but then you're severely limited in how much work you can get done, what kind of tools you can have, how many hours a week you can be in production, because you probably have neighbors, you probably have zoning or something else where the town or county that you live in has a say in what you can and can't do on the property you live on. A good example is that the shop I have here in Jefferson County, it took me 11 months to get the zoning variances to use this building, which has been a commercial building for 90 years, to get permission that would allow me to run my blacksmith shop in this building. So I basically had no income for 11 months while I was setting up this shop and getting the permits I needed in order to run it. So you have to be prepared to spend a lot of time and money before you even make your first dollar in a shop. The second thing is that property is something that you're going to have to pay for one way or another. Did you buy the property? Are you renting it? Do you have some sort of other arrangement, like is it on your father's farm or something like that? Well, at some point, you're going to have to come up with payments just for the space that you're working in. Now, real estate and zoning are different everywhere in the country, but I can give you sort of a fair general idea of what kind of costs we're getting into if you want to actually open a real shop. It's probably going to cost you about half as much to have the building as it would to have a house of a similar size in the general area that you're working in. So if houses are $200,000 in your neighborhood, a shop building is probably going to cost you $100,000. Same thing with rent. If it's not in an expensive commercial district in a downtown area in a town or city, just normal sort of commercial property, you can very easily spend several $1,000s a month renting a property that's got the right zoning and utilities to allow you to run a blacksmith shop. So the first expense off the top is how much stuff do you have to sell in a month just to have the space? The second question you ask is what other costs do you have as overhead? Because a lot of places you're going to have insurance just to be allowed to rent the building. if that's not included in the rental agreement or the mortgage you've got. That can be quite expensive. You have to have utilities, and you also have to think about property taxes, which you have to pay on the building. So these all come out of the overhead, and that's one of the other really important things to remember is you are the last person paid in your business. Your first overhead costs go to the federal government, the state that you live in, and the county you live in for income taxes, possibly corporate taxes if you're structured that way, state taxes, withholding for your FICA taxes, Social Security. All of that stuff comes out along with your other overhead, which comes next, which is the bank loan or the rental, the monthly rent. So you're always probably fourth or fifth in line if you're lucky, because you also have to pay your suppliers for materials and fuel and other consumables that you need to do the work. So you do not earn the first dollar. You earn the last dollar in your shop. So the next question is how much of your time is actually going to be productive billable time in your shop? I've told you that I typically spend 45 or 50 hours a week working on my business. So what does that mean? That means not just forging things in the fire, not just the fun stuff that everybody would love to spend their time doing. I mean, I run into people who think that that's all that's required to run a shop is that you know how to make things. Well, unfortunately, the real problem is that making things might be the simplest part of running a real shop. You have to get materials. If you're doing production work, well, you can figure that out pretty easily and just order the same amount of material every month and meet your production goals. But if you're doing custom work, you're constantly having to find materials that may or may not be available from local suppliers. Sometimes you have to find specific pieces of hardware or specific types of stock and materials that you have to get from somewhere. I mean, it's amazing the variety of things that are available and the variety of things that your clients will request as part of the job. So you have to spend time finding this stuff, ordering it, taking care of the invoices and billing and paying for it. This takes time. You also have to answer emails. You also have to answer your regular mail, your snail mail. You have to unpack things which have been delivered. FedEx and UPS know where I am because there's always boxes showing up that have to be dealt with. Then you have to actually put the materials that have arrived, the hardware that's arrived, you have to put it somewhere. So you have to cut the stock to put it in the stock rack. You have to file it away in the right drawer if it's a piece of hardware. You spend a lot of time organizing materials that have arrived in order to be able to find them. If you can't find it, it's as good as not having it. So you can't just leave piles of boxes with stuff lying around the shop. The next problem you've got is you're dealing with customers and clients. You're either having to answer their questions, you're having to design things for them. If you're doing custom work, you'll spend a lot of time making drawings and making proposals where not only do you make the design, but you've got to figure out what materials it will take to make that design and make an estimate of how much time you're going to spend building it so that you can give them a bid, an estimate of the costs of the project. And heaven help you if you're working for a state or federal government agency where you also have to deal with all the paperwork associated with putting in bids and contracts. This brings up another topic. Depending on the kind of work you're doing, you may have to maintain your registrations with different government agencies to have contracting opportunities. Like I do a fair amount of work with the Park Service. I have done a fair amount of work with other government agencies, so I have to maintain all of those contacts on the government websites, which, seeing as that's a moving target and every year they change things, you could spend an awful lot of time just updating your registrations and making sure that everything's current and correct so that they can find you to send you work. You also have to think about advertising and taking care of future expansion, and you're also, if you're very lucky, making enough money that you're looking for new tools. So you sometimes have to go look for tools, find tools, fix old tools that you may have purchased. This is all part of your overhead. So in a good week, I will tell you that I spend 20 to 25 hours actually making things. The other 25 hours of the week are probably overhead costs. They are doing things like I said, doing inventory, stocking materials, talking to customers, making bids, just sweeping the floor of the shop. This is a one-man shop. I do have some people that are associated with me, students, other people, who will occasionally do things for me, but if I tell you that that amounts to just a couple of hours a week of other people's time, that's a good running estimate, a good running average. So the first part of my calculation is that I have to make, in the billable hours of my shop, in 20 hours each week, enough money to cover the overhead for the week, and also, hopefully, pay me a wage. You are actually your own employee, so you have to make enough money to pay yourself. And hopefully, make enough money so that you can buy new equipment for the shop and keep expanding. So, what does that look like in terms of money as a tool? Well, I think the closest you can put it as a comparison to other businesses is if you have friends or relatives who are professional tradespeople, plumbers, electricians, pipe fitters, people who can be small contractors, any typical small contractor is going to have a similar set of problems. They're going to have overhead costs, they're going to have materials, vehicles, tools invested in order to be able to do their job. So when I tell people that your shop rate is probably at least a 4 times multiplier of what you actually earn, that out of your shop rate, if you have a well-run business, you probably are only making 25 cents out of every dollar that comes through the shop. If you're lucky and know what you're doing, that's the kind of money you're making. So think about what the rates are for trades people in your local area. Find out what the local plumbers are charging, the local electrical contractors charge on an hourly rate, and that gives you a comparison, just in a rough terms, of what your shop rate would have to be if you were running a real 40-hour-a-week kind of shop where you actually do custom work for the public, for contractors, for state, federal agencies, any of those sorts of people I was talking about. This also brings up my own topic for the day. Aside from everything else that's been going on in the world, I occasionally make YouTube videos. Now, to date, I'm closing in on having 100 videos up, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 subscribers. I think this morning when I looked, I had 945. And for people who don't pay attention to those things, supposedly when you reach 1,000 subscribers is the bare minimum limit for half of what you need for YouTube to actually start monetizing your website. So all of the effort I have put into posting YouTube videos for the past year, I have not made a dollar. It's all basically been overhead and getting things up and running. And when you look at the amount of money that YouTube actually pays people who have small subscribership and small viewership, like if you've only got 1,000 subscribers and you typically have less than 1,000 views per video, they actually don't pay you much of anything. I mean, literally, it's like pennies. At my shop rate, I sort of did a rough calculation for my average YouTube video. It costs me about $120 to post one YouTube video. So if you wonder at the times when I disappear for a couple or 3 weeks and don't post a video, it's as much for economic reasons as for any other reason, because I have to be careful of my cash flow, which is another term that you guys had better get used to if you want to run a business. That it's not how much money you make per year, it's whether you have the money at the right time to pay your bills. This gets into the question about whether you'll get enough of a track record to have a line of credit at your bank, whether you're going to have business credit cards, which is another way of borrowing expensive short-term money. That's another thing that you got to watch out for is if you're borrowing money on your credit card at 16 or 18%, this is another overhead cost. It'll eat you alive if you're not careful. So if you're starting out a business, please don't finance it on credit cards. This is about the worst thing you could do. But anyway, back to the YouTube videos. I have to come to a decision. I like making YouTube videos. I have enough knowledge, content, ideas in mind that I could probably make a couple of YouTube videos every week forever and not run out of things to tell you about. But from the money standpoint, I have to continue to pay my overhead costs and actually run the business, because I am not retired. I am still paying things off. I still have a mortgage on this shop. Hopefully for not much longer, but still for at least a couple of years in the future to come. And I have all of those other overhead costs that any small business has. And as I said, I don't get paid the first dollar, I get paid the last dollar after everybody else in line gets paid. So, what are the models out there for making some money and continuing to make YouTube? Well, there's Patreon and they're selling stuff. The idea that you make things on the videos and put them up for auction, or that you make t-shirt designs and have someplace like Redbubble or someplace like that drop ship them for you, make them for you. There's also the idea of Patreon and other sites like that, and I've actually started working on having a Patreon site, and fairly soon, maybe when this video is actually posted, I hope to have a Patreon site so that you guys can help support the videos if you want to see more of them and more often. It would be a help to send me some money, because like I say, I literally cannot afford to make as many of these videos as I would like to make. Okay, aside from my own issues and problems about money and YouTube, I'll go back to running the shop and why money is a tool. Because again, if you have projects, sometimes having enough money, enough cash on hand to buy the right tool to do the job saves you so much overhead cost in terms of labor that it's worth it. But it's very difficult to know how much time you're going to save with a new machine, or how much work it's going to take to pay for it. So if you see a beautiful new milling machine that you want to have, and it's $3,000 for the milling machine, ask yourself, how much work do you get in a year, or how much work could you get in a year with your skill level in the local economy to pay for that milling machine? because a good rule of thumb is that a capital piece of equipment, like a milling machine, a trip hammer, or something like that, you should get enough business to pay for that machine out of what you make on it in 5 years or so. If you're not getting enough business to pay for that machine out of the profits using that machine over a 5-year period, it's too expensive of a machine for the kind of work you're doing. You really can't justify it. Another concept that's sometimes hard for people to wrap their head around is that there can be several different values for the kind of work you're doing. You can value it as its closest commercial equivalent. Like, say you're making an axe for somebody. You can say there are companies in the commercial sector that make commercial products that are very similar to that axe. So you can say there is a commercial market price for an axe. Another way of looking at it is that because you're doing a custom job with custom design, particularly if it's the customer's design, what is it worth to the customer? So you have a custom value based upon the fact that nobody else is making them. So you get a cost that's based on it being unique to that customer. It may not have much value outside of that customer's desires, so you have to be careful. If you do something, a design which really is not saleable or not easily saleable to other people, if the customer falls through with the final payments on paying for the object, you might have to sell it to other people in order to make the costs, to break even making the costs. This is another concept. I've heard it sometimes called the farmer's problem, that farmers can never guarantee what the weather is going to be like. They have to have a running average based upon what the climate and the weather is in their area. So you might have somebody who's a corn farmer who will tell you that out of 5 years of a running average, he will lose money in 2 years. He'll about break even in 1 year, and 2 years out of 5, he will actually make a substantial amount of money. And the trick there is to make enough money on the 2 good years to carry you through the bad years or the lean years. And it's very similar in a blacksmith shop, particularly if you're doing custom work, that some jobs you are going to miscalculate how much it costs to make something. And if you have actually put in a bid to the customer that's a real estimate where you don't have wiggle room, you are going to have to eat the cost, the difference between what it actually cost you to make it and what the customer is giving you. You can't do that very often and stay in business. So a good working average, again, would be that you should, at worst, be breaking even out of 1 job in 5 and making money on 4 out of 5 jobs. And 2 of those 5 jobs, you're probably going to be a lot closer to break even than you'd like. This is just the way it works if you're doing bids and estimates. Now, that brings up the question of the difference between a bid and an estimate. A bid is something that you are sort of contractually required to keep to. An estimate is something where you can put brackets, a ballpark on it for the customer and say that, yes, from past experience doing similar things, it's going to cost, say, $400 at a minimum, and I know that it probably will not cost more than $500 to do that project. So if you put it in those kinds of estimate brackets, you can actually move the point around and do sort of a time and material thing where you're working on a project and charging the client based on your time and material. If you're doing real bids, You are the one that's responsible for whether you make money or not by how accurate your bid is. So you had better understand before you start just how much work it's going to be to make that project. The other way of looking at it is that you can have a price that's based upon what it's worth to the person that's ordering it. Because sometimes you have some items that are so hard to find, so few people make them, or are so out of the ordinary that you can actually make a fair bit of money making them because the client understands that he's going to have to pay a lot. And it's entirely possible on some of those projects to make multiples of your normal shop rate. These things don't happen very often. It's maybe 5 or 10% of the work that I might do in a typical year that actually makes me better than shop rates. But it does help with the times when, for whatever reason, you get caught because something wasn't right in your calculation for how much it was going to cost to make something that you put a hard bid number on. And like I said, if you've got an actual bid, you have to keep to it. You cannot wiggle out of it. If you've told somebody, particularly a contractor, that you're going to deliver something in a time frame at a certain cost, you had better well do that. Otherwise, you'll ruin your reputation in the contracting community, and nobody will come to you for work because they won't know whether you can be relied upon to actually produce what they need in the time frame that they need, because they quite often have performance contracts based upon having a project done on a particular date. And if they're standing around with their hands in their pockets waiting for your work to show up so that they can finish the job, they're losing money. You're costing your customers money. You'd rather be in the position of saving them money, solving their problems for them, not being a problem. I mean, ideally, you want to be the guy who, say a contractor has a job and he runs into something that he wasn't expecting. He's got a dozen guys working on a project and they're all standing around because a project, some part of the project has a problem. If you can solve that problem for them, that's worth hundreds of dollars an hour to him because he's paying those guys whether they're working or not. Some contractors will tell guys to go home, but a lot of contractors, it doesn't really matter if work is progressing or not. They have to solve the problem. So if they bring you something and you can drop everything and immediately get them back to work by fixing or making something that will keep the project going, that's worth a lot to them. And again, that's another situation where you can legitimately charge multiples of your hourly rate. Now, the other thing you'll run into is customers with unrealistic expectations, people who do not have any idea how much time and effort it takes to make something, people who unfortunately have watched bad YouTube videos and they think they know how hard it is to make something, and they will talk to you for quite a time before they come to talking about money. And their idea of what a job is worth may be way off from what it actually will cost you to make it. So rather than waste a lot of time listening to somebody talk at you for 20 minutes before you get into negotiating about price, it's very useful to sometimes start off by asking them the question, what's your budget and what's your timeline? So if somebody comes in and tells you that they have a budget of $500 and they start describing a project that's going to take you a month to make, you can short circuit it by telling them, this isn't a realistic budget. There's no way that anybody could make this for you for that kind of money. I've had some conversations where somebody will tell me what their budget is, and I have to tell them that I couldn't even buy the materials to build that for the amount of money that they've got budgeted. So you're sometimes in the position of educating your customer base as to the reality of time and materials. It's not magic. Stuff costs money, time costs money. You're worth a certain amount of money. I mean, aside from your overhead costs, it gets into the question of, as rare and highly skilled labor, what is an hour of your time worth? And if you can't make that after paying all of your overhead costs, it really gets to be a question of whether you want to do this as a business, that maybe you are better off staying as a hobbyist or as a part-timer. Another question that sometimes comes up in the unrealistic expectations department of dealing with customers is the timeline. You have other jobs and projects that are going on. If you're lucky, you're always working on at least 4 things at different stages at the same time. You should have a project that you're making drawings and doing estimates and bids for at the same time that you're purchasing material for a different project, at the same time as you are actively making parts of a third project, at the same time as you are completing and arranging for delivery of a 4th project. You need to be able to keep cash flowing. You also need to keep the flow of work, because dead time in the shop still costs you your overhead even if you're not doing anything. The unrealistic timeline thing is just that. You'll occasionally run into people who say they need it next Tuesday. And when you stop laughing and they ask you why you're laughing, you'll say, well, if I dropped everything else I was doing in the shop, I could do that. And they say, well, why don't you do that? And they say, well, can you pay me enough money to make my other customers happy? If I have to make 4 phone calls and tell 3 other clients why their job will be late, this will cost you money. I say it's a bad policy to give people the idea that they can buy priority. It occasionally happens, but it should cost them something to get your attention. An example from many years ago in my own life is that I once woke up at 5 o'clock on a Sunday morning to the sound of somebody knocking on my door. They woke me up and said, Dan, the trailer for my fishing boat needs to be repaired because I want to go fishing this morning. And your response to being awakened at 5 o'clock on a Sunday morning to somebody like that hopefully will not involve too much bleeding, but you will run into people who are so self-centered that they will actually do that. This is another reason to have a separation between your workspace and your home. There are people who think that if they can find you, they have a right to get your attention. I always try and disabuse people of that by telling them I have shop hours, I have an email account, I have a telephone number. You can leave a voicemail message, you can send me an email, you can actually show up at the shop and talk to me during shop hours. But please do not try and find me when I am on my own time. I have a life of my own and I guard it very tenaciously, because if you let people start picking and choosing when they can find you and make you work for them, you will have no life of your own. You need to have some walls, some really good walls between you and your work. You can enjoy your work, but you'll enjoy it a lot more if you also have time for your family, your friends, your own recreational activities. And this is also part of an important part of finding some balance in running the shop. If you find yourself working 70 hours a week in the shop, you're going to burn out. You won't be able to sustain that for long. Here is the last dollar in my hand. this is how much shop time this video has cost to this point. And that doesn't even come close to the costs of how much time I'm going to spend editing this video and posting it to YouTube. So if you wonder why YouTubers have to get Patreon support and sell t-shirts, it's because these videos do cost, even though they're free for you to watch. Dan Tokar at the Willow Forge. Bye.